Thank you very much, Kara, for the very flattering introduction. It was the most comprehensive one I've ever received in such a context. And thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity to present to you the topic of roads to open access from the Swiss National Science Foundation's perspective. I strive to be a bit strategically in this presentation, give you an overview of the measures the SNSF took in the past few years, and give you an overview where we stand and how we are going to proceed in the future with some practical remarks on what the SNSF is actually expecting grantees and researchers to do regarding open access and the regulations we have in place. I always like to use such an event and such an occasion to remind myself, as well as maybe even the audience, that the way we talk about open access has become very, very narrow in the past few years, and we focus very much on publications, and in a very, let's say, traditional sense of articles, books, book chapters, and so on. But open access is much broader, even in the way it was intended and laid down in declarations like the Berlin Declaration in 2003, where it states explicitly that it's about open access to knowledge. Knowledge just happens to be transported in publications today, but it's not the only way to bring around scholarly information and knowledge. A brief overview of what the SNSF did since 2014. Those are some select measures. And we had our first policy in place on the topic almost 10 years ago now in 2014. And in 2017, introduced a new policy and changed our regulations and started to provide funding independently of running grants with dedicated OA funding instruments in April 2018. And that's the way we still provide funding today for articles with article processing charges, books with book processing charges, and book chapters with BCPCs. Another very important point I would like to make is for the national read and publish negotiations that played a huge role for the ability of Swiss researchers to publish open access without worrying about any bureaucracy or handling invoices behind it. That are negotiations and agreements the Swiss higher education institutions concluded with the major publishers, but that also affects the output produced by SNSF-funded researchers to a great extent. In 2021, we made a change to how we handled article processing charges and went into a collaboration with the external vendor ChronosHub to simplify the whole process. And I'm happy to see that it developed in the direction that we were looking for. So grantees just take the invoice they got from the publisher, send it via email to ChronosHub, and in the vast majority of cases, that's all they have to do. And the invoice then gets handled by ChronosHub, and the SNSF in the end pays the bill. The most recent and very prominent change, at least perceived prominent change, was when the SNSF joined Coalition S, and we made two policy changes I will go into detail in a few slides ahead. One can summarize those whole measures into two phases. And the first one was really a transition from legacy publishing, do everything the same, but just have the results in the end be open access. And different priorities arose in the past 2 years. And we looked at what we, where we arrived, what have we achieved, and different things became important, not just getting the content open, lifting paywalls, but also to benefit from this content, this scholarly knowledge being open, and to ensure sustainability. And I will also go into that a bit further ahead. So where do we stand? This slide and all the other numbers I'm going to show you are part of a data story we publish each year on the SNSF's open access monitoring. The link is below. It's rather easy to find. And what is the most important point? We see that 77% of the publications emanating from SNSF-funded research are open access that were published in the year 2021. So we always have this time lag when we do our monitoring to ensure that the numbers are stable. So the most recent year we monitored was publication year 2021 and achieved 77%. And this was the biggest increase compared to publication year 2020 we have ever measured in our monitoring, as also indicated in the bar plot on the left-hand side. We are left with 12% publications that are not openly accessible and 11% other OA. Other OA, it's a bit of a difficult category, and it's mostly due to metadata availability. Other OA are publications where the databases we use tell us, yes, there is some version of a publication openly available, but we cannot really automatically verify, is it the most recent version? But we also cannot really decidedly say it's restricted access. So we count it neither as restricted nor as open access in a sustainable way, but keep it in this category of other OA. And there we saw a great improvement of 8 percentage points from 2020 to 2021. And I hope as systems increase, systems improve, and metadata infrastructure improves, that this category will vanish in the hopefully near future. And I want to highlight as other OA, that's nothing researchers have to worry about. That's really an infrastructure question of all the technology behind. If we look into details, so the different roads to open access, we see for publication year 2021, a growth in all the three major categories, gold, green, and hybrid. So in the gold road of publications being put out in a open access, in a purely open access journal, for example, we see 28% of publications published that way. We see 17% of publications made open access as a secondary publication in a repository, so the green route. And we see 32% being available in a hybrid route, meaning a subscription journal that also offers an open access option. And that increase to 32% is completely due to the read and publish agreements the Swiss higher education institutions have concluded with publishers. And we see that this has also an enormous effect on the open access rate, the SNSF measures for the publications coming out of our funding. And again, this 11% of other OA and 12% still restricted. So roads to open access, what are the requirements? All scholarly publications resulting from SNSF-funded research must be open access. And a scholarly publication is one that reports on primary research results coming out of a research project. So if it's a textbook used for teaching, that's not a primary research result, typically. If it's just a translation, a new edition of something already published, that would also not be a scholarly publication that's covered by this open access requirement of the SNSF. Articles have to be available immediately. So that's one of the changes we made to the beginning of 2023, that for all grants that were applied for from that date onwards, there is no acceptable embargo period for articles anymore. So the grants that will start sometime this year will have the requirement to make the articles available immediately. Book chapters still have an acceptable embargo of 12 months. And there are two major ways of fulfilling this requirement. Either a direct OA of the primary publication, so the gold route, if it's a purely open access journal, for example, and there is a cost related to that publication, so an article processing charge, or a book processing charge, or a book chapter processing charge, we have funding instruments that cover those costs. If it's a hybrid journal where the grantees choose to publish, then this, of course, also fulfills the ORA requirement of the SNSF, but we do not provide funding for hybrid journals because of the issue of double dipping and the same service the publisher provides getting paid twice. And the SNSF cannot ensure that this is prevented by reduced subscription costs, for example. So in that case, and this is the SNSF's policy since 2014, we never provided funding for hybrid publications. We do not do so now, and we don't plan to do so in the future. A diamond journal or diamond OA in general would obviously also definitely fulfill the OA requirement. And a second big strand would be indirect open access via a secondary publication. So we require at least the author's accepted manuscript to be made openly available, which means this is the latest version. It includes the revision authors make after a review was concluded. So it's really the final content. It's not the final document or version of record. So this version excludes the publisher's layout, typesetting, and other services that the publisher provides afterwards. And this version must be made available on an institutional or discipline-specific repository. So the institutional website or the personal website of a researcher does not suffice because discoverability is limited. If the content is made available in a repository, everyone who ever submitted something to a repository knows there is a lot of additional information you have to provide, authors, journal the manuscript was later published in, and so on. So the repository can link this information to the content they have in the system. They provide APIs, so search engines can find the content. That's all things that a website doesn't do. So the availability on a website just is not sustainable, also in the sense that the content can vanish anytime. Links to a website can break. The registered DOI the content gets on a repository ensures it is findable regardless of one specific place it was hosted at. So the change we made and the decision we took in 2022 was to join Plan S. 21 national funding organizations and 7 charitable and international funders, so 28 other funders in general, united in this international initiative. And we published our decision on 1st June 2022 that we will join and make some changes to the way SNSF requires open access. So what is Coalition S about? I like to advertise it as, well, a big working group of institutions that face the same issues, and a very unique working group because it's bringing together funding organizations that have a different challenge when dealing with open access than research performing organizations like universities have. So it's a forum of exchange and collaboration towards a common goal. And the common goal is based on the 10 Plan S principles that were published in 2018. The main idea is also to unite this group and to use it to build pressure on the system and on publishers instead of individual grantees, because the reach of every single funding institution that is a member of Coalition S is limited. But as an initiative, as a group, there is the ability there and the critical mass to make decisions, publish news, make changes that actually get a reaction from the whole publishing system. The last point I want to highlight regarding Coalition S is that it was always about diverse routes to open access. So it was never a gold-only initiative. The content in the end must be openly accessible. Gold is from a funder's perspective, easy to work solution because it's very close to the way the typical funding organization provides funding to their grantees in the first place. So it was easy to implement. and that's why it was perceived as the prominent one. But green or hybrid and transformative agreements, as well as diamond platinum, was also okay always. So what changes did we actually do when we changed, when we joined Coalition S and had to implement Plan S compliant regulations? So there were two changes. They looked big, but actually they were quite minor. So it was zero embargo for articles, and it was a CC-BY requirement regarding the license under which those articles are made available. And one important aspect, it only affects articles. So books, book chapters are completely treated the same as before, not part of the changes, not something Coalition S and the Plan S principles tackled in the first place. Zero embargo, what does it mean? How relevant is it? Embargo periods get discussed heatedly, also in the past. And working up to the decision to join Coalition S and implement the Plan S principles, we did an internal analysis in 2019 at the SNSF. And we used the monitoring data we had, used data from Sherpa Romeo on embargo periods that would apply to each individual article we could find. And we had a look at the question of if everyone who could took the green road to self-archive their articles, how would our numbers look like? And when we look back from 2019 to articles published in the window from 2016 to 19, we saw that 50% at the time were openly available. But we also saw that 37% of those articles could have been open access if they would just have been deposited in a repository. So those were articles, thousands of articles, where the embargo period was no issue, just the content never found its way to the repository. And this percentage grows smaller the more recent articles are. Now the embargo periods play a role, but even if the grantees would just completely abide by what the publisher asked, there would have been a large amount of content made openly available. So existing OA opportunities were not utilized. And one of the reasons for that, in my personal interpretation, was that the idea is I can publish, and 6 or 12 months later the embargo elapses, and then I have to take my content and send it to the repository. And well, if I look back at how I treated the content I produced in my active time as a researcher, I never think about such a thing half a year or even a year after the publication is done. So on the one hand, that's the philosophical reason. Embargo periods do not serve research and do not serve science. There is no legitimate reason for an embargo period unless it's absolutely necessary. And the time for this compromise and for them being necessary has elapsed. So going to a zero embargo and putting the interests of scholars and the public of making best use of scholarly knowledge first is just right. And the second one, we wanted to make an argument to submit the manuscript as soon as you have it, at the time you have it, at the time you received your author's accepted manuscript to your repository immediately, regardless of an embargo period in place or not, from your publisher. That was very important to make. A second aspect, we changed licenses. So a CC-BY license must be issued for an article. Prior to this change, the SNSF did not require any license for an article. And now we did the same as all the other Coalition S funders. The CC-BY, and if we look at the monitoring, this is also elaborated further in our data story. If we look at the monitoring, we see CC-BY already used in 44% of the cases we found for articles put out in 2021. So it's the majority that's already in CC-BY. We see the Second most used license CC BY and CND, but only in 14% of the cases. And okay, we have to admit, again, a big metadata issue. We do not know which license was used for 35% of the articles we monitored. But this change is important for usability of the published content, and is not a change that we feel hinders anyone in making their publishing decisions. So that's my last slide. Directions in open access. What are the important things today and in the years to come? The first point to make is sustainability and cost. If we look, if we do a prognosis of publishing costs into the future, we see it ever rising. That's an issue. And the main question is the way scholarly publishing is done and paid for today sustainable in the long term? And those are challenging questions we have to address, mostly together with those institutions that pay the largest share for scholarly publishing, which must include, obviously, the higher education institutions. The second point, ensuring scholarly knowledge is usable as broadly as possible. Now we get to the licensing question. It's very important to have a clear, legally usable license on the content. So, for example, someone can develop a large language model using legally available scholarly knowledge, do it in a way that attributes the first authors of the content correctly, and in the end bring a model and a product to market that really improves the way we can interact with scholarly knowledge in the future. And it cannot be done legally and in a sustainable way without correct licensing. And the biggest point is the last one I'm going to make, incentives and rewards. The issues around dysfunctionalities in scholarly publishing, the ability of few publishers to profit, let's say, extraordinarily from the public by extracting huge profits is linked deeply to the way reputation is awarded in research in general. And that is deeply dysfunctional because it's based on metrics that just don't make sense today. So we as a funding organization carry a big responsibility to go ahead and provide different ways to assess the past achievements of a researcher that are not solely based on a very, very limited part of the work they do, and that can be signified by our authorship on a publication. So just one bullet point to add there. From my point of view, the most important thing the SNSF did in the previous years to foster open science was to change the way curriculum vitae are collected when applying for funding, away from send us the longest publication list you can muster, and instead focus on your 5 most important breakthroughs, no matter what it was. Is in most cases a publication, but can be any other form of scholarly output as well that signifies your contribution and helps us evaluate whether you are the correct person to do the research you are proposing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for your talk. And it's nice because your last point is kind of a great introduction for one of our panel and talk for next week. But I would like actually to ask you a question, and it is about the embargo period. So basically right now, still a lot of people are publishing in hybrid or transformative journals. And there is still an embargo period for these journals and these publishers. And you are really making the point that you want to put pressure on the system and the publisher, and I get it. But on the short term, I feel you actually put a lot of pressure on researchers, because how can they actually comply with the SNF and also the NIH, because they also have a similar policy if there is still this embargo period. So they can't really follow the green route because they still have to wait 6 months to a year to deposit their accepted version of the manuscript.
So it's the question, is it doable, what we are asking?
Yes.
And I think the most important point I want to make as an answer is we always err and be lenient towards the researchers. So when we still had a 6-month embargo, the SNSF never got in touch with a researcher that had her article available after 8 months or so. Because we are not in the business of being nitpicky and looking at the minor details. So what we want to invite researchers to do, and what we require researchers actually to do, is to think about a publishing decision. And if they have decided a subscription journal that still asks, let's be more extreme, for a 24-month embargo is the best place to publish my research in, and they reach out to us, I would recommend, when you submit your manuscript, also inform the publisher that your funder requires you to make the content, at least in a manuscript version, available immediately, which is very reasonable, and there is no legitimate reason a journal would not do that. I'm well aware that it happens very frequently that the journals do not grant this exception. And then the researcher is in a dilemma. So whose rule should I abide by? And in that case, I would say, take your manuscript, send it as soon as you have it to your repository, publish at the place you see fit best. And from the SNSF side, you have fulfilled the requirement by reaching out to the publisher, because we also saw when we still were at a 6 months embargo, that publishers realized and took note of more and more Swiss researchers reaching out to them, and it was a need of their authors to be able to fulfill our requirement. And that is one of the ways we see the way forward. I don't expect zero embargo tomorrow. I don't expect zero embargo even 1 year or 2 years, actually, after we have introduced this requirement. And we will be very, very cautious regarding researchers not being able to abide by this requirement.
Okay, so following up on what you just said, is that really important for researchers to do at the time that they submit their manuscript, to make it clear to the publisher that they have this commitment to the SNSF for immediate open access?
Yes, that is important. So really, it shows they are aware of what we ask of them, and it's a terrible position for a research funder to put grantees, to put additional pressure and bureaucracy and the requirement to reach out and communicate what we ask of them to the publisher, because they always are in this middle position of having different requirements from all sides on them. In the worst case, also something completely different from their home institution as well. So we want to make it as simple as possible, but this reaching out to the publisher and making it clear, well, look, I'm SNSF funded, or today it becomes a bit easier. I have to abide by Plan S rules, which means they don't have to explain too much to a publisher. Reaching out and making this obvious to the publisher is important.
Julie, you're muted.
Apologies. So we have a question on the Q&A from Urs Jenol. And he is asking, so there are several parts in this question that we can keep also for the panel, but he's asking, how can the SNF actually absorb the cost for open access in the future if actually everyone is going to publish in open access journal? And also, what does it mean for smaller university in the years to come?
So the SNSF we are monitoring the spend we have in our budget, obviously, very closely. And we see it increase. So we are now at 3 times the amount we started from in 2018. We now see it bottoming it out a bit, so the increase, it steadied. We can absorb that, but we also have to be very transparent and say, well, we do not get additional funding from the federal government to pay for scholarly publishing. So every Swiss franc we spend on publishing is a Swiss franc we do not have to fund research, which is our primary job. So that's, of course, that there's a competition for this budget, and the bigger it gets, the more difficult it gets. And if budget restrictions from the federal side get more strict and more challenging, decisions have to be made. For the near future, I do not see a risk that the SNSF will not be able to honor its open access commitment and to continue funding as it is. Regarding smaller universities, this is also, well, the cost question is something that is highly and very actively discussed in the higher education community, and most importantly, also at the deciding bodies for, let's say, the open access strategy, the national open access strategy at Swiss universities. And it's a high priority. So when there should be solutions, we will make sure that it won't be a competition between institutions or any institution being left behind, because in the end, the switch to open access is about improving and not adding a burden that in the end, maybe a smaller institution or an institution of applied sciences cannot shoulder anymore.
Yes. Thank you very much. So I think it's time we move to our next talk. And as usual, I will see you in the next session in a minute.